When we think of ancient civilizations, DGYPT, Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, we often imagine grand palaces, epic battles, and monumental achievements. But beneath the glories of these societies lay a shadowed reality, the lives of millions of slaves, whose labor sustained empires, fed dynasties, and built civilizations. Understanding their daily life is not just a tale of suffering, it's a window into the social, economic, and human fabric of the ancient world. In ancient Egypt, for instance, many slaves were prisoners of war, debtors, or born into bondage. They worked on farms, in households, or on monumental construction projects, like the pyramids. Contrary to popular myth, not every pyramid builder was a chained slave. Many were skilled laborers who worked in grueling conditions, but were respected for their craftsmanship. Still, life was harsh, long hours under the scorching sun, minimal nutrition, and relentless labor marked daily existence. Food was basic bread, vegetables, an occasional fish or meat, providing just enough energy to keep the workforce going. Disease, injury, and exhaustion were constant companions. In Greece, slavery was woven into almost every aspect of society. Wealthy households employed domestic slaves who cooked, cleaned, and raised children, while others worked in workshops, mines, or as rowers in the navy. Rowing a trireme was especially brutal. Slaves endured long hours chained to benches, often under threat of punishment, yet their labor was critical for maintaining military power. Even in domestic settings, the hierarchy was strict. Slaves were expected to obey without question, and discipline could be harsh. Yet some, especially those with specialized skills, could gain limited privileges, earn small amounts of money, or negotiate better treatment. Rome, perhaps the most famous slave society, offers a window into both cruelty and complexity. Roman slaves performed a wide variety of tasks, from manual labor in fields, mines, and construction, to skilled work as teachers, accountants, or artisans. Some managed households with great responsibility, effectively acting as managers of wealth and property. Despite their legal status as property, slaves sometimes formed close personal bonds with their masters or found ways to leverage their skills for improved conditions. Food, housing, and clothing varied dramatically depending on the task and the master's wealth. Field laborers endured extreme hardship, while domestic slaves might receive better meals and shelter, but always under the strict control of others. Across all civilizations, slavery was a constant negotiation between power and survival. Daily life was regimented by labor, watchful eyes, and strict social norms. Punishment for disobedience could be brutal, whipping, confinement, or worse. Yet even under oppression, slaves found ways to assert small acts of autonomy, sharing stories, teaching each other skills, forming social bonds, and maintaining traditions. Religion and superstition sometimes provided solace. Egyptian slaves, for instance, might offer prayers to local gods for protection, while Roman slaves participated in household cults, creating ritual spaces of psychological refuge. Life as a slave also varied based on gender. Female slaves often performed domestic labor, worked in markets, or were forced into sexual servitude. Men were frequently tasked with physical labor in construction, mining, or agriculture, enduring extreme exhaustion. Some slaves, however, managed to earn freedom through service, skill, or purchase, though this was rare and highly dependent on circumstance. Despite the hardships, slaves were essential to the economic and social structure of ancient civilizations. They cultivated food, maintained households, built monuments, and even supported military campaigns. Their labor created the material wealth and stability upon which empires depended, yet history often overlooks them, focusing instead on the elite who benefited from their toil. By examining daily life, we glimpse the human side of history, resilience, adaptation, and the subtle ways enslaved people navigated a world that denied them basic freedom. If the first chapter gave us a glimpse of the shadowed world of ancient slavery, this chapter dives headfirst into the daily grind, the work, labor, and survival strategies that define the lives of millions. Slaves were the engine of ancient economies, performing tasks so varied and essential that civilizations simply could not function without them. In agriculture, which formed the backbone of most ancient societies, slaves toiled from sunrise to sunset. Egyptian slaves in the Nile Delta worked the fertile fields, planting, harvesting, and irrigating crops under relentless heat. The work was physically demanding, carrying heavy loads, bending in the sun for hours, and sometimes dealing with dangerous tools or animals. While bread and beer provided minimal sustenance, the daily monotony and exhaustion were punctuated only by short breaks or ritual celebrations when available. Survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on mental resilience and solidarity. Slaves shared tips, swapped duties when possible, and quietly helped each other navigate the harsh realities of labor. In mines and quarries, the stakes were even higher. Roman and Greek slaves, as well as some Egyptian workers, faced extreme danger in the extraction of metals, stone, and other resources. Miners worked in dark, cramped tunnels where cave-ins, poisonous fumes, and lung disease were common threats. Quarry slaves hewed massive stones for temples, monuments, and public buildings, often under the strict supervision of overseers. These jobs were typically reserved for the physically strongest, but even strength could not shield workers from accidents or relentless exhaustion. Despite the horrors, some slaves developed specialized skills, becoming valued for their expertise, which occasionally allowed slightly better treatment or small privileges. Domestic labor offered a different, though far from easy, experience. In Greek and Roman households, slaves cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and managed household affairs. While these tasks spared them the back-breaking physical labor of fields or mines, domestic slaves faced constant oversight and scrutiny, where any mistake could bring punishment. Interestingly, some domestic slaves gained close relationships with family members, especially children, or were trusted with financial and managerial responsibilities. These roles highlight the spectrum of slavery. While all were denied freedom, experiences varied, often based on skill, location, and the temperament of the master. Slaves also contributed to crafts, trade, and specialized professions. In cities, they worked as blacksmiths, potters, scribes, or artisans. Skilled slaves could earn small amounts of money or barter with others, creating a tiny measure of autonomy within a constrained life. Yet, even for the talented, social mobility was limited, and freedom was often conditional. In some cases, highly skilled slaves became indispensable to the wealth and prestige of their owners, a double-edged sword that brought protection but reinforced dependency. The daily routine of a slave was governed by discipline, hierarchy, and ritualized obedience. Overseers, guards, or masters monitored work closely, enforcing rules with physical punishment or threats. But amidst the strict regimentation, slaves found ways to assert small victories, a brief rest when the overseer looked away, sharing extra food with a companion, or quietly exchanging knowledge about survival strategies. Even tiny acts of agency became significant, reinforcing morale and creating a sense of community in adversity. Religion and superstition offered additional psychological support. Many slaves turned to prayer, household gods, or local deities for protection and comfort. In Rome, slaves might participate in the worship of Lares or Penates, gods of the household, seeking favor or mercy. In Egypt, offerings to gods like Ptah or Isis provided hope that their suffering was seen by higher powers. These rituals were more than superstition. They were a way to cope with trauma, maintain identity, and strengthen bonds among fellow slaves. Even food and living conditions, as simple as they were, became arenas of survival and negotiation. Slaves in urban households might receive leftovers from the master's table, while field workers relied on basic rations of bread, porridge, and occasionally vegetables. Water, shelter, and clothing were provided minimally, often tailored to ensure survival, but not comfort. The ability to preserve health, avoid injury, and endure illness was a constant daily challenge. While the work of slaves in ancient civilizations was grueling and relentless, their lives were not devoid of sociality, family connections, and human relationships. Understanding how slaves lived beyond their labor offers a more complete picture of their resilience, creativity, and humanity. Daily life was not just about survival, it was about forming connections, navigating social hierarchies, and maintaining a sense of identity under extreme oppression. In ancient Rome, some slaves were allowed to live in small quarters attached to their master's household, while others were crammed into communal barracks or rented spaces in the city. Despite these harsh conditions, slaves developed tight-knit communities, often centered around shared origin, language, or occupation. Fellow slaves became confidants, allies, and even surrogate family members, helping each other endure punishment, share food, and exchange practical knowledge. These bonds were crucial for psychological survival, as isolation and alienation could make an already oppressive life unbearable. Family life among slaves was complex and fragile. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, enslaved men and women often formed intimate relationships, marrying if permitted, and raising children under challenging circumstances. Children could be born into slavery, continuing the cycle, or sometimes granted freedom, depending on local laws and the master's discretion. Even so, parental care, education, and cultural transmission were vital ways that enslaved families preserved identity and community. In some cases, children served as a source of hope and continuity, motivating parents to endure hardships and resist despair. Religious and spiritual practices played a similar role in community building. In Greece, slaves sometimes participated in festivals or mystery cults, either clandestinely or with the master's permission. These rituals offered moments of shared identity, emotional release, and cultural continuity, helping slaves connect with their origins and each other. Egyptian slaves might make small offerings to household gods, while Roman household slaves maintained shrines, providing a sense of control and agency within a highly constrained environment. Slaves also maintained networks of mutual aid and resistance. Stories and gossip were not trivial, they were crucial for information sharing, strategy, and survival. For example, knowledge of the master's routines, hidden supplies, or potential dangers could mean the difference between injury and safety, punishment and survival. Some slaves even secretly taught literacy or practical skills to one another, empowering themselves in subtle but meaningful ways. These practices demonstrate that social life among slaves was both adaptive and resilient, enabling them to survive mentally as well as physically. Interactions with free individuals were another layer of social complexity. Trusted slaves sometimes acted as intermediaries between masters and outsiders, managing trade, finances, or household duties. Others might form relationships with freedmen, artisans, or merchants, navigating precarious but potentially advantageous social connections. These interactions allowed slaves to access resources, information, and opportunities that could improve their quality of life, even within the rigid structures of bondage. The role of women in slave society was particularly nuanced. Female slaves managed households, cared for children, and sometimes acted as concubines, all while maintaining informal networks of solidarity. Women shared childcare responsibilities, food, and advice, helping each other cope with physical and emotional burdens. Their social influence within the slave community could be profound, creating pockets of stability and resilience even under extreme oppression. Despite the hardships, slaves also created cultural and recreational practices. Singing, storytelling, games, and crafts were more than entertainment. They were psychological tools for coping, means to preserve cultural heritage, and subtle forms of resistance against dehumanization. In some households, slaves performed music or theater, preserving traditions and contributing to cultural life, often without recognition or reward. These acts demonstrate the enduring creativity and humanity of enslaved people. In conclusion, the social life and familial bonds of ancient slaves reveal a world far richer than the mere narrative of labor and suffering. Through community, ritual, kinship, and mutual aid, slaves found ways to assert agency, maintain identity, and survive psychologically under conditions designed to strip them of both. Understanding these dimensions is essential, reminding us that even in bondage, humans create networks of support, resilience, and hope that allow life, culture, and dignity to persist against all odds. While community, family, and subtle resistance offered some solace to slaves, the harsh realities of discipline and punishment defined much of daily life. Ancient civilizations were structured to maintain strict hierarchies, and slaves denied freedom and legal rights were subject to constant control. Understanding these mechanisms of control is essential to grasp the true daily experience of slavery. In Rome, punishments ranged from verbal reprimands to brutal physical discipline. Whippings were common for minor infractions, while serious disobedience could result in branding, shackling, or even death. Overseers carried out these punishments methodically, emphasizing the absolute authority of the master. Yet the very predictability of punishment also shaped survival strategies. Slaves learned to anticipate moods, navigate rules, and adopt behaviors that minimized risk. Discipline was not just enforcement, it was a psychological system designed to instill fear, obedience, and submission. In ancient Greece, particularly in mining operations like those in Laurium, punishment was relentless. Slaves endured extreme physical labor in dangerous conditions, often under the threat of beatings or confinement. Supervisors wielded rods, whips, and verbal intimidation as daily tools. While this may sound purely cruel, historians note that these measures were part of a systematic effort to maintain productivity. Mines, fields, and workshops depended on obedience as much as physical effort. Disobedience was not just punished, it was economically and socially dangerous for the owner. Egyptian slaves, especially those working on monumental construction projects, also faced rigid discipline. Harsh overseers ensured that quotas were met, often under threat of physical punishment. Yet these societies developed complex labor systems, with task rotations, rest breaks, and organized food distributions, suggesting that while control was strict, efficiency and survival were mutually important. Skilled workers sometimes received privileges, such as better food or accommodations, highlighting the variability of punishment and reward. In domestic settings, punishment was often less physically brutal, but equally psychologically demanding. Slaves in Greek and Roman households were constantly under scrutiny, where minor mistakes could provoke verbal abuse, humiliation, or reassignment of duties. The constant need to anticipate commands, maintain perfect obedience, and avoid attracting negative attention created an ever-present mental pressure. Even in seemingly safer environments, slaves were acutely aware that their livelihood and sometimes their life depended on flawless performance. Punishments were not uniform, they reflected status, skill, and utility. A highly skilled artisan might escape the harshest physical punishments, yet endure social humiliation or extreme workloads. Field workers faced the full force of physical discipline. Domestic slaves might endure psychological stress, social isolation, or coerced labor. Across all contexts, the system of punishment reinforced the power imbalance, reminding slaves of their subjugation while simultaneously creating opportunities for subtle negotiation or minor agency. Daily hardships extended beyond punishment. Food and shelter were often minimal, designed to sustain life without comfort. Clothing was basic and insufficient for weather extremes. Sanitation was poor, particularly in urban settings, leading to disease and infection. Medical care was limited and often administered only to protect productivity. Fatigue, injury, and illness were constant companions, and survival required resilience, observation, and strategic social maneuvering. Even routine tasks carried risk. In agriculture, fieldwork exposed slaves to dangerous animals, sunstroke, and physical strain. In workshops and mines, tools and materials could cause injury or death. In domestic service, mistakes in cooking, childcare, or household management could result in punishment or reassignment to harsher labor. Everyday life was a delicate balance of performing duties efficiently, avoiding punishment, and seeking opportunities for small reliefs or rewards. Interestingly, slaves developed coping strategies to endure hardships. Humor, storytelling, singing, and rituals were not just entertainment, they were psychological tools. Knowledge sharing, secret alliances, and small acts of defiance allowed slaves to maintain a sense of control and dignity. Even in the most oppressive environments, the human need for agency, community, and emotional relief persisted, shaping survival strategies that historians now recognize as essential to understanding ancient slavery. In conclusion, the discipline, punishment, and daily hardships of slaves were central to their experience and to the functioning of ancient societies. Physical, psychological, and social pressures ensured obedience, yet slaves continuously adapted, resisted subtly, and built resilience. Life in bondage was harsh, relentless, and powerless, but within that framework, slaves demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, endurance, and humanity, revealing a side of history too often overshadowed by the achievements of the free and powerful. While discipline and labor dominated much of a slave's daily life, the basic necessities, food, clothing, and shelter shaped the daily rhythm and survival strategies of ancient slaves. These seemingly simple elements were crucial not only for sustaining life, but also for maintaining morale, health, and endurance under extreme conditions. In ancient Egypt, slaves working on farms, construction projects, or in households had diets that were simple but functional. Bread made from emmer wheat, porridge, onions, garlic, and occasionally fish or meat formed the bulk of their nutrition. Beer was also a staple, providing hydration, calories, and mild intoxication that could temporarily ease physical strain. While not luxurious by any means, this diet sustained long hours of labor under the blazing sun. Interestingly, Egyptian laborers sometimes received extra rations as rewards for exceptional work or adherence to quotas, highlighting the subtle interplay between sustenance and discipline. Roman slaves experienced a wide spectrum of food quality depending on their roles. Field laborers and miners often received meager rations, coarse bread, vegetables, and the occasional legumes, just enough to keep them working. Domestic slaves, particularly in wealthy households, had better access to food, sometimes eating alongside free family members or receiving leftovers from banquets. The Roman reliance on bread, olive oil, and wine meant that most slaves consumed calories sufficient for survival, but rarely for comfort. For some, access to small gardens or the ability to trade with fellow slaves allowed minor improvements in diet, representing tiny acts of agency in an otherwise constrained existence. Clothing also reflected status, labor demands, and climate. Egyptian slaves wore simple linen garments, often minimal for a field labor, but sufficient for basic decency and sun protection. Roman slaves typically wore wool or linen tunics, sometimes patched or hand-me-downs, reflecting both economy and practicality. Slaves in urban workshops or households might have slightly better clothing, particularly if their tasks required more mobility or presentation. Yet clothing was never a luxury. It was functional, standardized, and tightly controlled to emphasize the inequality and hierarchy of the society. Shelter, likewise, varied with task, skill, and status. Agricultural laborers often lived in rudimentary huts near fields, with crude bedding, minimal insulation, and shared space. Domestic slaves resided in attics, basements, or small rooms within the master's household, sometimes crowded, but closer to food and supervision. Urban slaves might live in communal lodgings or rented rooms, though often under strict oversight. Sanitation was basic, and living spaces were often damp, dark, and uncomfortable. Despite these conditions, slaves created micro-communities, personalizing spaces, sharing items, and establishing routines that soften the harshness of daily life. In addition to survival, these necessities were often leveraged for subtle negotiation or reward. Extra bread or wine could be earned through obedience, skill, or minor favors. Clothing repairs or better sleeping arrangements might be traded or granted to favored slaves. Such interactions reveal a complex economy of small incentives, where masters could reinforce loyalty, while slaves found ways to improve their living conditions within limited possibilities. Nutrition, clothing, and shelter were not only practical concerns, they also shaped social and psychological life. Adequate food and protection could improve stamina and mood, while deprivation amplified hardship and vulnerability. Slaves had to strategize not just for work performance, but also for survival, often relying on mutual aid, resourcefulness, and communal support to meet basic needs. In conclusion, the daily necessities of food, clothing, and shelter were far more than mundane details. They were central to the experience, endurance, and social dynamics of ancient slaves. These essentials influenced physical survival, psychological resilience, and social interactions, creating a foundation upon which all other aspects of slave life, work, punishment, family, and community depended. Understanding these elements allows us to fully appreciate the resilience, ingenuity, and humanity of people who lived their entire lives in bondage. While the harsh realities of labor, discipline, and basic survival dominated much of a slave's existence, ancient slaves also carved out moments of personal expression, entertainment, and ritual, small but meaningful ways to assert humanity in oppressive conditions. These activities reveal that even under bondage, people sought connection, joy, and spiritual comfort. Music and storytelling were central to the social and emotional life of slaves. In Egypt, Greece, and Rome, slaves would sing while working in fields, mines, or workshops. These songs helped coordinate labor, maintain rhythm, and alleviate boredom. But they also offered psychological relief, allowing workers to mentally escape the harshness of their environment. Storytelling, too, provided a shared cultural experience, passing down myths, legends, and moral lessons, while reinforcing bonds among slaves. Some stories contained veiled critiques of authority, heroic figures who outwitted oppressors, offering subtle forms of resistance. Religious rituals offered another form of solace. In Egypt, slaves often participated in the worship of household or local gods, making small offerings or prayers to Ptah, Isis, or other deities. These rituals provided a sense of control in an otherwise powerless life, allowing slaves to appeal for protection, favor, or justice. Roman slaves maintained shrines to the Lares and Penates, participating in ceremonies that reinforced community cohesion and spiritual comfort. Even in private moments, such rituals became a lifeline, a way to retain identity and connection to tradition. Festivals, market days, and communal celebrations also created opportunities for leisure and social interaction. While these events were often controlled by masters, slaves found ways to participate in music, dancing, and shared meals. In some households, slaves were allowed to organize minor entertainments for each other, such as games, storytelling circles, or small theatrical performances. These activities offered temporary respite from labor and punishment, creating spaces of autonomy and collective joy. Crafts and skill-based hobbies were another outlet. Slaves with artistic or practical talents, pottery, weaving, metalwork, or painting could engage in their crafts during rare free time. These activities were often utilitarian, contributing to the household or economy, but they also allowed creative expression and personal pride. For highly skilled artisans, their work could provide slight social leverage or privileges, demonstrating that even constrained lives could be enriched through skill, creativity, and innovation. Personal time, although limited, was used strategically. Slaves might share meals in small groups, exchange news, or teach each other survival skills. Humor and play were particularly important. Jokes, teasing, and light-hearted competitions provided psychological relief and reinforced social bonds. Even in the most oppressive settings, slaves found ways to experience joy, forge relationships, and assert humanity, emphasizing resilience and ingenuity. Sexual and romantic relationships also played a role in personal life. In some cases, male and female slaves formed consensual unions, providing emotional support, companionship, and familial structure. These relationships were fraught with complexity, particularly where masters exerted control over reproductive rights or sexual access, but they remained a crucial source of connection, hope, and identity. Children born to slaves could become part of the household, sometimes inheriting the status of their parents, creating continuity in otherwise precarious lives. Even small acts of subversion or autonomy became meaningful rituals, sharing extra food, passing on secret knowledge, or quietly asserting preference in work tasks were subtle forms of resistance. These practices were not just survival tactics, they were affirmations of individuality and agency, allowing slaves to maintain a sense of self in a society designed to strip it away. In conclusion, the entertainment, rituals, and personal time of ancient slaves reveal a dimension of life beyond labor and punishment. Through music, storytelling, religious practice, crafts, social interactions, and subtle acts of autonomy, slaves created spaces for emotional, cultural, and psychological survival. These moments illustrate the remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and humanity of people living under extreme oppression, showing that even in chains, the human spirit sought joy, connection, and meaning. When we think of slavery in ancient times, it's tempting to imagine total submission, men and women silently enduring their fate. But that picture is misleading. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond, slaves engaged in resistance, sometimes dramatic and bloody, sometimes quiet and subtle, but always rooted in the refusal to let masters fully control their lives. Let's start with the big rebellions, the kind that made it into history books. Rome, in particular, was famous for its slave uprisings. The most well-known is, of course, Spartacus' revolt in 73 BCE. Spartacus was a gladiator slave who escaped from a training school in Capua. Along with about 70 fellow gladiators, armed initially with kitchen knives and spits, yes, literal cooking equipment, he sparked a rebellion that eventually grew into an army of around 70,000 escaped slaves. For 2 years, Spartacus' forces defeated Roman legions, terrorized the Italian countryside, and struck fear into the heart of the Republic. His story became legendary, not only as an act of defiance, but also as a symbol of what happened when oppression pushed people too far. But Spartacus wasn't the only one. Earlier revolts included the First and Second Server Wars in Sicily 135-13 to BCE and 104,100 BCE. These weren't just minor disturbances, they were massive, organized uprisings where slaves declared leaders, captured towns, and even minted their own coins. Imagine being a Roman senator, hearing that a group of property was suddenly behaving like a rival state. These revolts revealed the ever-present fear among masters that their slaves outnumbered them, and if united, could bring society crashing down. Of course, rebellion wasn't always grand or organized. Many slaves resisted in quieter, everyday ways, what historians sometimes call weapons of the weak. These included working slowly, deliberately breaking tools, feigning illness, or conveniently forgetting instructions. In Egypt, scribes recorded complaints from overseers about slaves who seemed to have an endless supply of excuses. The ox was sick, the sun was too hot, or the chisel broke. Whether these were genuine or strategic delays, they show that not every command was obeyed with enthusiasm. Escape was another powerful form of resistance. In Rome, runaway slaves called fugitivi were such a common problem that specialized bounty hunters and even professional slave catchers existed. Runaways risked brutal punishment if caught, but many still tried. Some escaped to join bandit groups in the mountains, others blended into city life as free citizens. The fact that laws and police systems had to be constantly adjusted to track fugitives proves that running away was both frequent and feared. Even within the master's household, there were opportunities for defiance. Slaves who worked closely with their masters, like personal attendants, tutors, or secretaries, sometimes used their access to manipulate situations, spread gossip, or withhold information. In extreme cases, slaves even participated in plots against their masters. Roman history is full of tales of poison cups, open doors for assassins, or whispered secrets that brought down powerful men. For example, the conspiracy against Emperor Domitian in 96 CE reportedly involved household slaves who provided crucial access. Religion, too, offered a subtle way to resist. In Rome, slaves often adopted or blended their own gods with the household cults of their masters, preserving cultural identity in the face of forced assimilation. In some cases, religious gatherings provided cover for slaves to meet secretly, build solidarity, and exchange information. These weren't always rebellions in themselves, but they planted the seeds of unity and reminded slaves that they belonged to communities larger than their immediate bondage. It's also worth noting that resistance wasn't always about violence or sabotage. Sometimes, it came in the form of asserting dignity, singing songs from one's homeland, telling stories that celebrated freedom, or carving personal marks into tools and walls, acts of cultural survival. These might seem small, but in a system designed to erase individuality, even minor gestures of self-expression were powerful. From the master's perspective, this constant undercurrent of defiance created a world of paranoia. Roman writers frequently warned slave owners not to mistreat their property too severely, not out of kindness, but out of fear that cruelty could spark rebellion. Household slaves were sometimes forbidden to gather in groups larger than 3 or 4, just in case they started plotting. Even the Roman Senate once debated whether slaves should be forced to wear uniforms, but quickly abandoned the idea when someone realized it would show just how outnumbered the masters really were. So, what does all of this tell us? Resistance among slaves in the ancient world was not a rare exception. It was constant, simmering beneath the surface of daily life. Whether through revolts, escapes, sabotage, secret worship, or quiet acts of dignity, slaves found ways to say, "You may own my labor, but you do not fully own me." And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing. In societies built on bondage, where laws, armies, and traditions conspired to strip people of agency, enslaved men and women still found ways to push back, resist, and remind their masters and themselves that the human spirit cannot be completely shackled. Slavery wasn't just a social system in the ancient world, it was a business model, a legal framework, and the backbone of entire economies. If you lived in Egypt, Greece, or Rome, you couldn't walk through a city, farm, or temple without seeing slavery woven into everyday life. To understand why slavery endured for so many centuries, we need to look not just at the suffering of the enslaved, but also at the laws that sustained the system and the economic machinery it powered. The economics of cheap labor. Let's start with Rome, because Rome perfected slavery as an economic tool. By the 1st century BCE, scholars estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Italy's population was enslaved. Imagine walking through a Roman villa. The kitchen staff, gardeners, tutors, cleaners, farmhands, scribes, and entertainers, all slaves. Why? Because slavery was the ancient equivalent of cheap, permanent labor. Wars fed the system. Every Roman conquest, from Greece to Gaul to the Middle East, poured hundreds of thousands of captives into the slave markets. After the Third Macedonian War, 168 BCE, so many Greek prisoners were enslaved that the price of a slave in Rome dropped dramatically. Like when a market is suddenly flooded with goods, victorious generals didn't just bring home gold, they brought home human beings, who became the workforce of the empire. And slavery wasn't limited to Rome. In Athens, enslaved miners extracted silver from the mines of Laurion, fueling the Athenian navy that defeated Persia at Salamis. Without slaves hacking away in dangerous tunnels, there might never have been a golden age of Athens. In Egypt, massive estates and temples were staffed by enslaved laborers who worked the fertile fields of the Nile, producing the grain that fed the kingdom and later the Roman Empire. Slavery as property, but for slavery to function, it needed laws, and the laws were chillingly clear. A slave was not a person, but property. Roman legal texts refer to slaves as res, all things, just as a cart or a cow could be bought, sold, rented, or destroyed. So too could a slave. That didn't mean there weren't rules. Masters could generally punish their slaves as they wished, but extreme cruelty sometimes triggered intervention because of sympathy, but because the slave was considered an investment. Beating a slave to death was like burning down your own warehouse, economically irrational. Roman law thus positioned slavery as a regulated asset, with the state ensuring that property rights were protected above all else. Contracts were key. Slaves could be leased out for work, used as collateral for loans, or included in wills. In fact, one Roman legal case details how a man tried to reclaim a slave who had been borrowed by another family for decades, as though someone had taken out a very long-term rental. The price of human beings. Slave markets were everywhere. In Rome, the Forum hosted bustling auctions, where slaves stood on platforms with placards listing their skills. Cook, speaks Greek, farmhand, age 25, strong and healthy, or educated boy, trained in mathematics. Prices varied wildly. A field laborer might be bought for the equivalent of a few months' wages of a common worker. A skilled Greek tutor, worth a fortune. And yes, there was also the trade in enslaved women for domestic service, companionship, or sexual exploitation. Markets didn't hide this fact, it was simply another category of use in the economy of bondage. Legal loopholes. Manumission. Interestingly, the legal system also allowed for a manumission, or the freeing of slaves. In Rome, freed slaves liberti could become citizens, though with limited rights, and continue to work for their former masters as clients. This wasn't an act of kindness, so much as a calculated move. Granting freedom could motivate loyalty, create future allies, or display generosity. Augustus, the first emperor, even had to pass laws restricting mass manumissions, because too many slaves were being freed at once, threatening to destabilize the citizen body. In Greece, freed slaves often became metics, resident foreigners who paid taxes but couldn't vote. In Egypt, manumission was rarer, but some temple slaves managed to buy their freedom through years of service. Slavery as infrastructure. It's hard to exaggerate how deeply slavery underpinned ancient infrastructure. The Colosseum, built by enslaved labor, aqueducts, roads, and temples, maintained by slaves. Even cultural life. Greek plays, Roman literature, Egyptian monumental art was shaped by enslaved scribes, actors, and artisans. Without them, the empires we admire today would have looked very different. In short, slavery wasn't a side note to the economy, it was the economy, and the laws ensured it stayed that way by framing humans as assets, binding them into contracts, and embedding them into the machinery of war, agriculture, and culture. Ancient societies built systems of power and profit on the backs of millions. Of course, this system came with risks. Every master feared revolt, every market required constant supply, and every law tried to balance control with exploitation. But for centuries, slavery remained the invisible engine of civilization, producing wealth, power, and glory while erasing the humanity of those who made it possible. Slavery in the ancient world was more than a set of economic arrangements and punishments. It was wrapped in meaning, religions, legal codes, and the great minds of the age gave people reasons to accept, regulate, or sometimes oppose bondage. In other words, if you wanted to keep slavery running smoothly, you didn't just need soldiers and markets, you needed stories, laws, and arguments that made it feel normal, inevitable, or even right. This chapter walks through those stories and arguments, the theologies and philosophies that either kept chains in place or quietly loosened them, and it does so with the sort of half-amused, half-sober voice you want in a late-night history podcast. Let's begin with the most practical of the trio, law and religion as social glue. In the ancient Near East, codes like Hammurabi didn't invent slavery, but they regulated it. Slaves were listed in contracts, given legal valuations, and protected in limited ways simply because they were valuable property. That protection was not born of compassion so much as calculation. A slave beaten to death was a lost investment. Still, the presence of legal rules, who could be enslaved, how disputes were settled, what happened if a master stole a slave, gave slavery a sense of order. Law made bondage legible to ordinary people. It turned scattering human beings into a set of manageable transactions and penalties. Religion, meanwhile, supplied the moral vocabulary. In ancient Egypt, social harmony, Got, was the cosmic order. Everyone had a role to play. Kings maintained cosmic balance, and everyone else played their part. Slavery fit into that picture as an uneasy but integrated fact of social life, rather than a moral scandal to be relentlessly debated. The gods upheld order. Humans fulfilled roles. That kind of theology makes bondage look like one more component of a stable world. Move west to ancient Israel, and we see a different mix. Sacred texts that both regulate and limit slavery. The Hebrew Bible contains laws that clearly accept slavery as an institution, but also introduce constraints that were unusual in the ancient world. Hebrew slaves were, in several places, to be released after 6 years of service. There were rules forbidding cruel mistreatment in particular cases, and the Jubilee every 50 years. In the ideal vision, could restore lands and free certain dependents. Crucially, the laws drew a distinction between fellow Israelites and foreign captives, a distinction that made the system messy. Humanitarian limits applied to some, but not to all. Still, the presence of release provisions and ritual protections gave religion a moral grammar that could be used as a lever for reform, even if that leverage was small and uneven in practice. Then there's the Greek philosophical angle, which begins to convert moral reality into argument. Thinkers from Plato to Aristotle didn't talk about slavery the way legislators did. They tried to place it in a philosophical system. Plato, in his idealized state, imagined strict social roles, but his view on slavery is ambivalent. He doesn't make it the central issue, and his Republic is more concerned with ruling than with labor. Aristotle, however, gave the most famous ancient philosophical defense of slavery. In politics, he argues that some people are slaves by nature. That is, some individuals supposedly lack the rational capacity to govern themselves, and are therefore better off ruled. This is uncomfortable to modern ears, because it converts human inequality into an ontological fact. Some people, Aristotle claims, are naturally fit to be ruled and naturally fit to rule. It's an elegant rationalization for elites who want a moral philosophy that justifies economic exploitation. It's also an argument that, within its own conceptual frame, allowed Greek city-states to think of slavery as part of nature rather than only an unfortunate convention. Not everyone in the Greek world agreed. Cynics and some early sophists mocked conventional social hierarchies. The Stoics later introduced a powerful counter-idea, the notion of a universal human reason that undercut slavery's moral foundations. If all humans share a divine reason, the Stoic argument runs, then external status, a free or slave, cannot touch inner worth. Stoicism didn't abolish slavery. Far from it. Stoic philosophers often lived comfortably within slave societies. But the idea that all humans participate in the same rational divine spark planted seeds of moral unease. When a former slave like Epictetus rises to be one of the most respected Stoic teachers, the gap between theory and social practice becomes visible. Stoicism offered a moral language for criticizing abuses while still living inside the system. Roman intellectual life inherited both Aristotle's rationalizations and Stoic critiques. The Roman legal world, however, was practical. Slaves were race, things, tradable and accountable. Yet here too opinion varied. Seneca, a Roman Stoic, argued for a humane treatment. He urged masters to treat slaves more kindly, not because slavery was virtuous, but because cruelty corrupts the master's soul. Seneca's tone is revealing. He rarely calls for abolition, but he urges improvement of conditions and dignified treatment. That blend, leveling the moral ground while stopping short of dismantling the economic system, is a recurring ancient pattern. Religion and philosophy also shaped emotional arguments about bondage. Many traditions frame slavery as a result of war, sin, or cosmic misfortune. In some readings, bondage was a punishment from the gods. In others, it was a social byproduct of conquest. That theological framing made slavery intelligible. Misfortune, divine will, or the natural consequences of political struggle. If slavery is the fruit of divine justice, it becomes ethically complicated to oppose it without challenging transcendental order itself. Early Christianity presented one of the most interesting tensions. On one hand, the New Testament contains passages that accept the social reality of slavery. Paul's letters, for example, instruct servants to obey masters. Ephesians, Colossians, and silence can often feel like complicity. On the other hand, Christianity preached a radical spiritual equality. All are one in Christ. That gospel language, neither slave nor free in Paul's theology, would later be used as a powerful moral critique of slavery, even if, in the short term, it did not translate into a political program for abolition. Anecdotes matter here. Paul's letter to Philemon about Onesimus, a runaway slave, is a small but potent case. Paul pleads for humane treatment and asks Philemon to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother. It is not an explicit call to end slavery, but it reframes the master-slave relationship with spiritual equality. Over centuries, this language became theological ammunition for critics of the institution, even as early Christians lived within it. Across many ancient traditions, then, two patterns emerge. First, religious and legal systems often tried to domesticate slavery, regulate it, limit the worst abuses, and integrate it into moral life so that whole societies could function without constant moral collapse. Second, philosophical and religious ideas sometimes provided the tools to critique slavery from within. Universal human dignity, spiritual equality, and ethical refinement didn't always abolish slavery, but they undercut the most brutal rationales for it and made reform conceivable. Those critiques mattered. They produced incremental changes, better laws in certain regions, increased manumissions, and social practices that sometimes made life more bearable for some enslaved people. They also created intellectual resources that much later generations would draw on in arguing for abolition. But it's crucial to remember the paradox. The same intellectual cultures that generated eloquent defenses of human dignity often accepted, rationalized, and regulated slavery in practice. Philosophy could both bless the system and, quietly, undermine it. Finally, a word about historical perspective. Judging ancient thinkers by modern standards can be an effective moral exercise, but it can also flatten complexity. Rather than painting ancient religion and philosophy as uniformly pro or anti-slavery, it's more accurate to see them as instruments people used, sometimes to justify domination, sometimes to restrain cruelty, and sometimes to imagine a different moral horizon. The ancient world did not lack moral imagination. It lacked the modern political structures and moral consensus that would make abolition a realistic policy across whole societies. So where does that leave us? In a complex place. The ancient intellectual and religious landscape provided both justification and critique. It kept slavery stable long enough for empires to grow, but it also planted the language of equality and human worth. Those seeds would take centuries to germinate fully. For listeners today, the lesson is double-edged and instructive. Moral arguments matter. Sometimes they prop up injustice. Sometimes they become the slow tools of liberation, and ideas, handled well or badly, shape the fate of real people for generations. If the previous 9 chapters felt like walking through half-forgotten rooms of history, workyards, kitchens, shrines, and prison-like quarries, then this final chapter is the one where we stand back, dust off our hands, and try to see the whole house. What patterns repeat? What surprises us? What do the daily lives of slaves in Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond reveal about power, human resilience, and the way societies are built? Let's be blunt from the start. Slavery was foundational. It built empires, funded luxury, and made public spectacle possible. But it also shaped ideas, emotion, and the everyday texture of life for millions. The big lesson is both obvious and awkward. The glorious monuments and the lofty philosophies of antiquity were paid for in sweat, bruises, and stolen lives. That doesn't reduce human achievement, far from it, but it forces us to see achievement in 3 dimensions: creators, consumers, and the invisible hands that made both possible. The twin engines, economy, and order across civilizations, to forces made slavery stubbornly persistent. The economic logic of cheap, controllable labor, and the institutional desire for social order, conquest, crime, and debt were steady supply chains for the slave market. When Rome conquered, captives became property. When a city produced surplus, elites bought comfort with other people's labor. At the same time, laws, religious narratives, and philosophical arguments knitted slavery into the moral fabric. If laws call someone property and religion frames social roles as cosmic, the system acquires inertia. It becomes not only economical, it becomes thinkable. But the logic wasn't flawless. Every system that treats humans as assets stores instability, revolts, escapes, and everyday sabotage. Ancient masters understood this. With a career full of legal codes, patrols, and punishments, they tried to convert human unpredictability into predictability. And yet those very attempts at control were the core tension. A productive system that depends on repression contains within it the seeds of its own disruption. Everyday resistance, the small, potent things history likes: dramatic uprisings, because they make tidy narratives. Spartacus, the Sicilian slave wars, the burned villages. But the more constant, historically consequential thread is quiet resistance. Slaves hoarded small favors, feigned illness, sabotaged tools, passed secret lessons, and kept cultural memory alive through song and story. These were not merely survival tactics, they were assertions of personhood. Think about that. When the official story says property, songs and clandestine rites say I. Those intangible acts, singing, telling myths, preserving language, were the slow, daily undoing of dehumanization. They didn't always topple regimes, but they sustained people long enough to make more dramatic forms of resistance possible. The lesson: resistance is often small, relational, and cumulative. The moral landscape: ideas that both justified and undermined slavery. Religions, laws, and philosophers did double duty. They made slavery tolerable for rulers and provided the vocabulary for conscience. Some traditions normalized bondage of cosmic order or punitive consequence. Others, especially strands of philosophy and later religious thought, introduced contradictions. Humans are equal before God. All reason is universal. Those contradictions mattered. They didn't instantly abolish slavery, but they produced moral pressure and legal reforms, manumissions, limits on cruelty, and social practices that occasionally improved conditions. It's worth noting the irony. The same intellectual cultures that produced eloquent defenses of human dignity often structured societies that treated people as commodities. That contradiction is a recurring human story. Ideas can reinforce oppression or provide the tools to critique it. Often both happen at once. The human work of survival, agency in constrained spaces. If you listen closely to the stories of ancient slaves, certain forms of agency keep coming back: earning small sums, leveraging skills, building reciprocal networks, petitioning for freedom, and practicing religion. Even the ability to craft a small object at night, to teach a child a language, or to bake extra bread and share it quietly, those are tiny economies of dignity. In some cases, such activities could lead to manumission or social mobility. More often, they simply kept the mind and body intact. This practical agency tells us something important about human adaptability. Under extreme constraints, people find margins to exercise will, keep relationships, and make meaning. It's not the heroic narrative of sweeping liberty, but it's the stubborn, day-to-day assertion that life matters. Cultural memory and the long shadow slaves didn't just suffer, they shaped culture. They were artisans, musicians, teachers, and caretakers who left traces in language, cuisine, religion, and craft. The cultural life of ancient cities: music in tea houses, technical skill in workshops, religious practice in household shrines, often carried the imprint of enslaved people. That influence is tricky to quantify, but to ignore it is to participate in selective memory. Moreover, the histories of oppression and resistance became resources for later generations. Ideas about equality and dignity that emerged from religious critique, philosophical reflection, and the testimony of freedmen contributed, slowly and unevenly, to later critiques of bondage. In other words, the moral language that would eventually fuel abolitionist movements had antecedents in the very societies built on slavery. The cost of convenience, a contemporary mirror. We don't tell ancient history to feel smug about moral progress. Instead, we read it as a mirror. The economies and social habits that made slavery plausible, then economic inequality, legal loopholes, systems that place profit over people, have analogues in later ages and in different guises today. That's not to equate ancient slavery with modern problems. Context matters, but the structural lesson endures. When systems value efficiency and property over human dignity, exploitation follows. That's uncomfortable because it invites reflection on modern labor practices, human trafficking, and the hidden costs of comfort. Understanding the past sharpens our view of present choices. It's not moral grandstanding, it's practical insight. Systems structure behavior, and laws and narratives shape what societies are willing to tolerate. Final notes on memory and responsibility. If history's job is to tell a truthful story, then the daily lives of slaves demand honesty. We can admire monuments and still name the hands that built them. We can study philosophy and still hold it accountable when it excuses abuse, remembering the everyday realities of slavery. Food, shelter, song, revolt. Ritual doesn't reduce human achievement, it enriches our understanding of how complex and costly human societies really are. There's also a quieter responsibility to carry these stories forward in ways that honor the humanity of the enslaved. That means more than footnotes in grand narratives. It means centering labor, lived experience, and resistance in how we teach, remember, and represent the past. It means recognizing that dignity persisted even when legal status denied it. Closing, a human note. Here is the image I'll leave you with. A cool morning on a Roman villa's outskirts. The workday is about to begin. In one hut, a group of women knot their hair, exchange a whispered joke, and pass a small loaf. In a nearby courtyard, a skilled artisan sharpens a chisel and hums a tune from a distant homeland. An overseer walks by, ledger in hand. The world is harsh, the rules are cruel, and the structures of power are imposing. Yet between ledger and chisel, life persists small, stubborn, and human. That stubbornness is the real story, not the institutions that rationalize slavery, nor the markets that fed it, but the daily acts of relationship, resourcefulness, and resistance that made people more than property. If we close this book or press stop on the recording, let it be with that tension in mind, to recognize the course behind ancient grandeur, and to honor the lives that